So COVID-19, of course, has spread globally. I think that there is hardly any country or territory in the world that has not yet been touched by COVID-19. And as we know, the number of actual cases is likely even larger than the official numbers that we have seen due to uneven and generally very limited testing worldwide. And I think that the same is true also here in Indonesia. Because of very limited data and because of how new this disease is, I mean, if we think about 3 months back, nobody, even though COVID-19 had already been notified by China, nobody was even talking about it. Things really picked up a lot in March. So this is really something that is very new to all of us and where things are moving very rapidly. And in the meantime, we actually have very limited data. So key parameters of the disease remain relatively unknown, which makes the kind of the strict containment measures that many countries have been implemented necessary at present to prevent overwhelming the healthcare systems around the world. But while necessary, some of these containment measures, which have been implemented by 90% or more than 90% of governments around the world, these measures really paralyze economic activity and have a very significant economic impact. So when we think about the impact on different economies, we think about two different channels, which will be the importance of which will vary according to the economy. There are external channels, and those were the first ones to hit, when the disease hit China in the first place, which is via supply chains, it's via commodity prices, and especially tourism. Tourism is very heavily affected by any kind of epidemic that goes beyond a certain group of countries, because people get very concerned about traveling. And at first, people were comparing a lot with what happened in SARS. But of course, this turned out to be much more severe. So in addition to these external impacts, which will be important to different economies, we also have the first round of the direct impact on a number of industries where you no longer can have the economic activity because of the mobility restrictions. So things like restaurants, things like entertainment, those industries where you would have mass gatherings that would actually contribute to spreading the disease, economic activity cannot continue there, and that is purely from the domestic measures that are taken to contain the disease. So in the case of Indonesia, the commodities are still very important. So on the first round, we expected already a negative impact through commodities, through investment that oftentimes depends on commodity prices, a little bit on tourism, although tourism is not as big in Indonesia as in some of the other ASEAN countries. But so we already expected some impact coming into early March. And I think that over the last 2 months, things have evolved very quickly. Now Jakarta is under more strict social distancing measures. So now a lot of the domestic sectors, a lot of the services sectors, especially the wholesale and retail trade, transport, accommodation and restaurants have been severely affected and are also going to lead to a slowdown. Then we have the kind of the second round effects that as the businesses are unable to operate, the balance sheets will start to deteriorate and the bank balance sheets are going to also deteriorate as the NPLs rise. So this is also why there is attention being paid that you don't want these companies that are just for the time being unable to operate. It's not because they're bad businesses, it's just because of the impact of this crisis, which we all expect to be temporary. So these might be very good businesses that are just temporary, not allowed to operate. You don't want these businesses to then go bankrupt and then take a long time for the businesses to start up and running again after the crisis is contained. So this is going to be something that is very important when we think about the recovery from the crisis and what are some of the policies to make sure that companies can actually be basically put into some kind of hibernation during this period so that they can then wake up, once the disease is controlled. And this is important because it's very different from a financial crisis. In a financial crisis, by definition, a lot of firms actually did take excessive risk. Maybe they had excessive debt. So it is part of the natural economic cycle that some of these firms, especially in order to avoid moral hazard, if a company took on too much debt, then you should not just let go of the debt. But this is a different case, right? So those companies, they are in trouble now, not because they took on too much debt or because they have necessarily bad business models, but because of the mobility restrictions which are necessary for the containment of the disease. So in terms of looking at what the government has been doing, of course, this affects the government operations, and this is not the time for looking very closely again at the fiscal deficits and the fiscal rules, where one might have looked at in the past, or the debt level. I mean, the debt in a way is a form of insurance, right? I mean, you actually live from your income on a normal basis, and it's precisely when you have this kind of crisis that you actually should go and borrow. And in that sense, it's good that Indonesia starts with a very low debt level, so that it actually has some credibility in the market to go and borrow additionally in order to finance some of the expenditures. Looking at externally, for the more kind of technically inclined in terms of balance of payments, exchange rate, Indonesia's situation is also, compared to other countries, fairly strong. It has a lot of reserves. There's a lot of collaboration between the Bank Indonesia and other central banks, and not only Bank Indonesia, where the central banks are guaranteeing each other the availability of foreign currency. And in particular, the Federal Reserve in the US has made available foreign exchange that can be exchanged for rupiah, so that there's no dollar shortage. So that if people want to sell rupiah and get dollars, that Bank Indonesia actually has sufficient reserves. And in that sense, although a lot of people complain about the exchange rate, that's also what the exchange rate is supposed to do when you have capital outflows, when you have a moment of crisis, when the exchange rate weakens. That means that the firms that are sending profits to their headquarters, they make their profits in rupiah. So when the rupiah depreciates, that's fewer dollars that Bank Indonesia needs to come up with for those companies repatriating their profits. So that also helps with the external financing. But now I move to what I think is actually the more important short-term concern, which is the impact on people. Right, so we do expect that in addition to the health impact, that there's a big economic impact on people from all of these mobility restrictions, and all of this economic impact that we talk about is not for its own sake, but because once the businesses are unable to operate, many of them then become unable to pay salaries, and then people become unable to then consume, and in some cases even not have enough for nutrition or for their basic needs. And in that sense, the vulnerable and what we call the aspiring middle class households, I mean, a lot of these people in urban areas, maybe people engaged in the gig economy, your Gojek drivers, your Grab drivers, people, small food sellers, the little satay cart down the street. I mean, these are people that are under normal times, they have good business. They are not in the, near the poverty line. Obviously, they are in the informal sector. They're not protected by any kind of labor contract. So under normal circumstances, these families are actually, they're doing okay. But now if you have mobility restrictions and there's nobody to buy the satay anymore, or the traffic has been, very severely restricted, then you can actually go from being, 3-4 times above the poverty line to being, very close to or even below the poverty line. So in our view, this is really the group that is probably relatively more heavily affected. Of course, Indonesia, at the bottom 40% of the families in terms of income, they are also very vulnerable because they are already at kind of very precarious levels of income to begin with. But relatively speaking, many of them are still engaged in agriculture. They're still in rural areas. So relatively speaking, the impact may be less severe than some of these urban aspiring middle class, urban informal sector. But of course, they're also, from a starting point, much more vulnerable to begin with. So it makes a lot of sense to also make sure that those families in the bottom 40 are looked at, to make sure that the children have enough nutrition, and that those families can meet their basic needs. And also, in particular, a lot of the poor, they tend to suffer more from the burden of the disease in general. The other point on the impact on people that is important to pay attention to is the significant and inequitable impact on human capital. As the schools close and then everyone has to do studying from home, of course, doing the studying from home is going to be much easier for the better off families that have access to internet, that have access to online learning. Some of the poorer families, that's going to be more difficult. So especially, again, considering that there's already quite a significant inequality in terms of human capital and learning, and how important it is for Indonesia, I think that focusing on how to helping, especially the lower income households, catch up is going to be very important. The other point is that you don't want families to take kind of measures that will be kind of to meet their short-term needs. You don't reduce your long-term potential. So, one very obvious one is that if there is not enough food for children, that of course is going to be very damaging for the long term. Another coping strategy. So let's say that you have some farm animals, or let's say that you have, some small assets that you use for your business, like a sewing machine. If in order to get basic needs, you have to sell that, then, what do you do afterwards in order to recover your purchasing power and your income generating power? It becomes very difficult. So it's very important to take those aspects into account when thinking about the policy response, which is what I want to turn to next. So the first point on the policy response is on the disease containment measures. So that's the kind of the health first measures, and we see that there was, these you see correspond actually quite closely with what the government of Indonesia's package that was put together. So with some budget for a very significant increase in the budget for the health sector. Here, of course, it's important to continue to increase the preparedness. Make sure that, when we talk about flattening the curve, I'm sure that everyone has heard about flattening the curve, which means that, you don't have so many people coming at one time into the health system that it exceeds the capacity. But how much we need to flatten the curve also depends on the capacity. So the more that the government can do on an emergency basis to expand the capacity of the system, to buy the equipment, to mobilize the doctors, the resources, then of course, the more you raise the capacity and the less you need to flatten the curve. Second very important point is on expanding laboratory capacity. Testing is very important, as well as using ensuring that you have developed a plan to use rapid testing technology to detect some of the antibodies. This is something that actually takes a lot of planning in order for the country to be able to implement these tests, these antibody tests. But that is going to be essential for a responsible exit from the very restrictive measures, so that you can start slowly allowing the people who already have the antibodies to have more of a freedom of movement, because they cannot be infected and they are not infecting anyone, as opposed to those that actually should remain probably for a bit longer under some kind of mobility restrictions. So, and this is an important parenthesis, there are these two types of tests that people sometimes, at least I used to get very confused. One is the test to just determine whether you have the virus or not. These are called the PCR tests. And those are the tests that you get in the hospital if you're suspected of having COVID. And then there is these antibody tests, which is to detect not so much that you have the virus with you at that time, but that you've developed the antibodies to actually combat the virus. So it's a sign that you have or had the virus in you, but that you've actually formed the antibodies that can kill the virus. So these two types of tests have very important roles, and especially the antibody test in terms of having a good plan of how to deploy them quickly is going to be important to make sure that Indonesia has a sustainable exit from the mobility restrictions. So moving on to the measures to protect livelihoods. So these are mostly going to be cash transfers, right? So the government has already announced increases in PKH. They've announced, the Sembako card so that people have access to food. In some cases, actual distribution of food. For the informal unemployed, I understand that they have already launched the applications for the Kartu Prakerja, targeting a lot of informal sector workers that can then get maybe some additional training so that they can use this mobility restriction period, to kind of build up their human capital. So those are very good, and we are still kind of looking into to make sure that it is necessary to actually reach a lot of Indonesians, because a lot of people will be unable to continue to earn normally. And I'll give the example of my own country of Brazil. In Brazil, and we have a fairly conservative government right now, they have approved a similar kind of cash transfer, not only to the poor, but also to the informal sector. Many of them, might be kind of on this similar aspiring middle class, which combined with, and then combined with a wage subsidy. So those in the formal sector, you actually tell the firms and said, look, you can actually reduce the amount of time that you need the worker. You can reduce their work hours by up to 75%, but then the government comes in and obviously up to a limit compensates that so that the worker remains employed with that firm. The firm can reduce the payments to the worker, but then the state comes in and makes sure that the worker actually has most of their income still retained. So you have cash transfers to the bottom, to the very vulnerable poor people. You have cash transfers to the informal sector, and then you have a way to try to get firms to retain workers. And this is important because you remember what I said about the financial crisis and the importance of hibernating the firms. Part of hibernating the firms is ensuring that you actually have the workers coming back after the crisis, because if you have to rehire people, that also is going to slow down the recovery. So there's a benefit to the economy to ensuring that those workers that you perhaps put a lot of effort into selecting, that you can actually retain them so that when the crisis is over, you can quickly restart. So these are on the protecting livelihoods. A lot of good programs have been put out, but we need to look into whether it has sufficient coverage or whether maybe even additional programs can be put in place to make sure that people's livelihoods are protected. In terms of protecting livelihoods, there's also the concern about prices, right? Because livelihood is about the income you have and what your income can buy, which depends on prices of things. And one is concerned that with some of the supply chain disruptions from the crisis, that there may be an issue with the prices. So for that, reducing the prices and availability of food and medical equipment by eliminating and streamlining unnecessary restrictions in imports, now is actually a good time to try to do that. Will also help with the purchasing power and to protect livelihoods. Next point is on the business side, right? So on the business side, we have the short term and the long term. In the short term is, again, this hibernation. So ensuring that the firms in the short term, those that are not operating in essential areas, that they can hibernate. That means that interest payments, rental payments, wage payments, that there is a way for them to be able to not make those payments while they don't have the cash flow. In some cases, a deferral is appropriate. In some cases, you would want to give them some kind of a moratorium for the time being. And there are programs that Bank Indonesia with OJK have been working on with firms to restructure their debt. And I think that looking at programs similar to the one in Brazil about providing some kind of a benefit for the firms that are still retaining the workers while the workers are still receiving the wages, but the firms are not making that cash flow, is also going to be useful. So this liquidity to allow the firms to hibernate and not close down, while avoiding the moral hazard and while avoiding making sure that there are no kind of zombie firms that are staying. I think that's going to be very important. And then in the longer term, there is the issue of then stimulating recovery. So after the disease is contained, there will be a need to actually ensure that the firms can reopen. So that means that how do we repair the balance sheets of the banks? How do you repair the balance sheets of the firms for the economic recovery going forward? And then I think that what I might conclude with in terms of the going forward, I think we talked about flattening the disease curve. Many people talk about flattening the recession curve, right? So through some of these measures of liquidity to firms, through some of the measures of the protecting livelihoods. So I think that the third point is to flatten the debt curve, right? So during the time of the crisis, it's okay for the debt to go up. So the debt curve goes up during the time of the crisis. That's natural, and that, as I said, that's what that is for. But then the government needs to also have plans, not for immediately, but for after the crisis, to how do you then flatten the debt curve. And in the case of Indonesia, that will require some very robust revenue measures. Indonesia has one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world. The state does not have enough resources in order to provide the right level of social protection programs. Health spending has tended to be very low compared to other countries. So in the long term, in order to reduce the debt levels and in order to properly resource the state, really increasing tax revenues is going to be very important. And it's also important to make sure that this is done with a lot of credibility. So in the sense that maybe actually having some measures that are done now of how do you compensate some of these corporate income tax cuts that have been announced, maybe looking at measures on the value-added tax, looking at measures on personal income tax, which are still relatively low in Indonesia, and looking at issues of compliance with paying taxes. Those are going to be very important, so that, obviously not now. I'm not saying that now is the time to raise taxes. It's not. But, we are thinking that this crisis will be contained. And then after the containment period, once the economy is recovering, then there will be the time for some of these tax measures to increase the tax collections and flatten the debt curve. The debt curve. So I will close here, and I will open up for questions. And I thank everyone for listening.
Okay, thank you so much, Frederico. The questions are now open. But before I hand it over to the participants, I guess I have the privilege to ask the first question as the moderator. You raised an interesting point about the hibernation of companies, a term that you introduced here, because it differs with a financial crisis where we should rather let the companies go bust due to their risk taking that is over the top. But when you talk about the hibernation process for companies, are there certain sectors that need to be hibernated that has higher priority to be hibernated, or it should be almost all the sectors, or just sectors that are really impacted, or I don't know if there's like some more important sectors than others?
That's a good question. So I think that first we need to distinguish, which are the sectors that are providing the kind of essential goods and services that need to be protected. So for example, food production, all the production of medical equipment, the health sector. So those are the sectors that, they need to be prioritized in terms of ensuring that they can actually get the access to their inputs, and that the mobility restrictions are tailored so that these sectors can continue to operate and as safely as possible, minimizing the risk for their staff. But at the same time, those are also economically less impacted, right? So if those are the essential sectors that are still running when everybody else is shut down, then those sectors probably would have less of a need. They're not going to be hibernating. In fact, quite on the contrary, they're the ones that are going to be up during this winter of the COVID containment. Now, on the firms that are outside of these sectors, some of them actually there is room for seeing how things can be repurposed. So many of these firms, maybe one can help, again, not by hibernating them, but by converting what they do. And you've seen some examples of that in terms of firms that are now they used to manufacture cars, but now they're manufacturing respirators. They used to produce certain types of garments or textiles. They start producing the protective equipment for medical personnel. So if it's possible to repurpose, that's also a helpful kind of injection of economic activity for those firms. And then they will not need to be hibernated. Now, for all the other firms, I mean, I think that it's difficult to then select which sectors are more or less affected than the others. I think that is something that we can see exposed. I mean, I think that we can anticipate that things like transportation, things like wholesale and retail trade, that some of those industries might be more affected. And I think that, once one starts thinking about the stimulus post the crisis, post the hibernation, how much, do you need to, how much coffee do you need to give to some of these companies to wake up? I think that then again, one may want to look at, distinguishing by the different sectors, which ones actually may need a bit more coffee at that stage. But I would not necessarily target them now. I think that now is basically just keeping them from shutting closing their doors. And then afterwards, once we are in a position to stimulate the recovery of economic activity, then I think that there will be different, that you need to tailor the stimulus differently to different sectors.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Rizka. I'm from Jakarta Post. The previous session with Mr. Gita Wirjawan, actually, he suggested that Indonesia will need 1.6 quadrillion rupiah to cover the wages and let the most vulnerable people to have some sort of income security. And he suggested to do it through quantitative easing. And what do you think about it? Will it be possible for Indonesia to apply quantitative easing to kind of cover this cost, the 1.6 quadrillion rupiah. And then for hibernation, you suggested the hibernation, especially it would be very useful for SMEs particularly, but how will it impact other sectors that are related to the business, like property sectors or energy or utility? Can you explain it a little bit more? Thank you.
So in terms of, we are still studying in terms of the, the number and the amount. So I'm very interested to hear Gita's estimate, but we do not have a similar estimate that I can speak to. As I said, I mean, I think that one would need to look at to make sure that a lot of the urban informal sectors are covered. So that's something that may require some kind of additional transfers going forward, especially if the movement restrictions have to be extended beyond the 2 weeks that they have been announced for. Now, in terms of paying for that, I think that the Perpu that President Jokowi signed allows Bank Indonesia basically to buy the government bonds in the primary market. So this is essentially the quantitative easing. So this is something that Bank Indonesia has not done, and it's something that is done on an emergency basis. So it's good that Bank Indonesia has that ability to be able to fund the government if the government needs it. I think that what will be important in that case is just to have a very clear communication strategy about how do you exit from this. Because in the short term, there is this kind of very sharp slowdown of economic activity. I don't think that people believe that in the very short term, while the mobility restriction measures are in place, that this would be inflationary. But of course, that implies that in the longer term, once things start getting back to normality in terms of economic activity, one would have to withdraw this quantitative easing. So I think that it's important to have a clear communication of the plan. It's okay to be able to fund the government in the short term if necessary, but one needs to have a plan as to what is going to be the framework for when this quantitative easing will be in place and when it will be withdrawn, so that there's not excessive current account deficit, there's not excessive inflation in the system because of the additional injection. I think that it's important to highlight that this, again, it should be seen as a last measure, but not as a last measure that, at this time of very deep crisis, is a last measure that we may have to use, the quantitative easing. But it is a last measure in the sense that if Indonesia can go into the global capital markets, as it did recently, the interest rates globally, despite the increase in the risk premium and uncertainty, interest rates are still quite attractive. Indonesia was able to raise I think that $4.3 billion very recently in the market at fairly attractive interest rates. And that was actually a very forward-looking thing that the government did to actually be one of the first emerging markets to go out and tap on these global financial markets, because people know that this is not a financial crisis, this is a short-term crisis. Indonesia's finances have been fairly well managed, not only for the last 5 years or 10 years, but really since the Asian financial crisis. I think that the reputation of Indonesia's macroeconomic management is very strong. So I was pleasantly surprised, but maybe not too surprised, to see that a lot of international investors were actually willing to extend that credit to Indonesia at rates, 3-4%, still, relatively not excessive rates that the country will not be, that will affect the debt sustainability of the country. So I think that looking at this kind of external financing, if available, I think that one might find that actually, because there is a lot of liquidity injected in the system by global central banks, it may or may not be necessary for BI to very aggressively finance and do a lot of quantitative easing. If it's necessary, to protect people's livelihoods and to ensure that the economy can restart, by all means, I think that will be very supportive of BI playing that role, as long as there is this clear communication strategy, but also to look at other sources of funding that might actually be available, and that, if available, they would actually be better than relying on the quantitative easing. You mentioned about what are the kinds of firms and sectors that would be helped during this hibernation kind of period. I think that for the very, very small kind of micro enterprises, those that may not even have a bank account, or they're maybe even too small to get a loan, they may even just employ a couple of people on a very informal basis. So for those firms, actually, what the global experience suggests is that providing transfers through various social assistance schemes is actually the most effective. Rather than trying to identify micro enterprises in this or that sector, just ensuring that the individuals have appropriate cash transfers so that they don't have to sell the sewing machine, or you don't have to sell your motorcycle in order to keep, to provide the basic needs for your family, because you're receiving that support. That actually may be the best assistance for these very micro firms. For firms beyond that, I think that there are these different programs. If you have loans, already there are the programs on electricity, right? So you don't cut off the electricity. You have programs on taxes. So for all the firms that are beyond the micro-sized firms that are part of either that have loans, that are paying taxes, there are a number of measures that can be taken, and many of them have already been taken in terms of ensuring that you minimize the cash outflow that firms have to bear. And I think that applies all the way from these kind of small firms to large firms, although of course some of the larger firms, they may have a better ability. So there's more room for burden sharing among the larger firms as opposed to the smaller firms. But I would, again, for the very micro firms, I think that social assistance is still best. And for the other firms, you would look at the kind of the big source of cash outflows, and you would target those specific areas to make sure that they can do this hibernation.
I'm Dimas from Boston Consulting Group. Now, I just have 3 questions for you, Federico. And I think what you mentioned is quite interesting. So my first question and the context to it, right? A couple of days ago, I saw a webinar from Ray Dalio from Bridgewater Associates in TED channel. He mentioned that this crisis that we have is actually quite severe, and he said that it's comparable to the Great Depressions in the 1930s. Now, I would just like to know what you think about it. Is it that severe? Because obviously, if I'm not mistaken from your statement, was it's a short shock to the economy, but obviously it's a very different view from Ray Dalio. So I would like to know what you think about that. My second question has to do with the playbook, right? Obviously, sooner or later, government around the world, they're gonna print more money. They're gonna pour a lot of monetary supply to the market, right? And we all know that once this happens, there will be an inflation. And every single time that we have a crisis, there's always a widened gap between the rich and the poor, right? Now, what is missing from the playbook, right? So that this time when we hit the crisis, right, like the bottom of it, and we try to recover, and post-crisis, we don't have a widened gap between the rich and the poor. So what are the missing links in the government playbook so that they don't make the same mistake again? My third question is actually from what you mentioned about the example in Brazil, which is very interesting to me, how the Brazilian government tried to put money to the informal sectors. I would like to know, having been working in Indonesia and looking at this in Indonesia, what do you see as the major obstacle, a major challenge for Indonesian government to do the same like what the Brazilian government did? Thank you very much.
I mean, I think that there's just a lot of uncertainty about the crisis. I mean, I think that one thing is that we do expect these very, very severe contractions in economic activity in the first half of the year at least, because of the mobility restrictions. So we might actually see the yearly growth rate around the world to be lower than, for most countries is going to be at historic lows for all the recorded data, because you have this decline in economic activity over a couple of months. So I think that the expectation is that in terms of the numbers, that this 2020 is definitely going to be worse than the global financial crisis in 2009. I'm not sure how it will compare with the 1929, but certainly there will be a very large number. I think that the two key uncertainties, and one is more kind of outside the control of policymakers than others, but basically both of them in a sense are. One is the controlling the actual epidemic, right? So if we manage to get the epidemic under control, if there's treatment, vaccine, better testing, governments manage to keep people at home, some of these things may happen sooner rather than later. They be more or less effective. But the sooner we get the disease under control, obviously, the sooner economic activity can restart, and the stronger is going to be the recovery going forward, right? So that's I think one difference with a financial crisis is that, in theory, you should, once the disease is controlled, you should be able to restart the economic activity. You haven't had a major destruction. It's not like a war that there's a lot of destruction of physical capital. And if we manage to control the disease quickly, also in terms of the cost and lives, the human capital is also not destroyed. If the firms are still there, then the institutional capital of the firms are still there. So restarting the economy should be more vigorous, and in theory, it should be easier. But of course, that depends on how quickly we need to contain, right? So if we're still, having this conversation in December because the disease keeps coming back, the number of fatalities keeps increasing, then of course the depth of the economic crisis is going to be multiple times what we're seeing now. So containment of the disease is going to be extremely important, but it is something that, as I mentioned in the beginning, there's still a lot of uncertainty as to what it will take and when we can feel that we're going to be getting out of these mobility restrictions. The second point, which I think is certainly more under control of the policymakers and where you see a lot of activity, is precisely on this putting the firms in hibernation mode. If policy is such that the firms are allowed to keep the doors open so that they can actually, or not keep the doors open, but keep the lights on so that they can reopen their doors, even if it's 6 months from now or 9 months from now, if the firms are still there, then I think that we also will see a relatively faster recovery than you would in the case of a financial crisis, as happened in 97 or as happened during the Depression in 1929, when monetary policy was also, actually quite restrictive, and there was a lot more ambiguity about using monetary policy at the time. I think that with all the difficulty of implementing policy, and these are all institutions run by human beings, I think that central banks have actually moved and governments have moved quite in a very coordinated and aggressive way to respond through monetary policy and fiscal policy to meet the kind of the short-term livelihood and liquidity needs of the economy. So for those reasons, I think that one can be more optimistic that this may not be as deep as it was in those crises. But of course, those policy efforts are going to have to continue. One has to continuously reevaluate what it will take to keep things from completely shutting down. Because if they do shut down, then of course, if you have that magnitude of a shock and then all of these firms shutting down, then it will take months for people to start, investing again, to start hiring people again. And then, of course, as this whole process means that it will take then a lot longer. Then maybe Ray Dalio could be right. But I do see with some optimism the fact that governments have been very aggressively focused on ensuring the liquidity and the payments. Maybe sometimes it may take longer than people feel is ideal, but you do see a lot of movement in what has really been something very recent. Now, you mentioned inequality, and you mentioned the fact that monetary policy is very loose. And this is why I mentioned that there needs to be a plan and a clear communication of the plan on how this is going to be withdrawn, right? So especially if we are right that this is something that is a short-term shock, it means that in relatively short order, there should be a robust recovery. But then there needs to be a clear communication that during the robust recovery, the monetary stimulus needs to be withdrawn in order to maintain the macroeconomic stability and precisely to prevent the increase in inflation. As I said right now, because demand is so weak, there's so little movement right now that all the money that is being pumped in through the central banks, it's not causing inflation right now. But you're right that if during a vigorous recovery, there is no withdrawal of this quantitative easing, then inflation will pick up. And I think that the central banks understand that. And I think that it will be important for us to start hearing as one starts looking at normalization, what are the plans for how to orderly reduce some of this monetary accommodation. In terms of inequality, I think that this reflects the importance of having things like unemployment insurance. It reflects the importance of having a solid healthcare system, because for a lot of people at the higher income brackets, they have access to private healthcare. it's less of a big deal for them. So a lot of the ways in which inequality is lower in some of the European countries is not because there is no inequality in earnings before tax and even after tax, right? So tax systems can do a lot to help, but it's mostly through the expenditure side, ensuring that everybody has high quality healthcare, that there is unemployment insurance, that the quality of education is very high, that there is a building of the human capital of the country. Those are things that play a very important role, not only in terms of the human capital and the productivity of the country going forward, but also in terms of addressing these inequality issues. And this gets back to my point on taxes. Ultimately, these things cost money. And in the long term, right now it's okay to borrow, but in the long term, you cannot finance these things through borrowing. You have to finance them through revenues. So having a higher tax to GDP ratio, it doesn't have to be a Scandinavian country of having 50% tax to GDP, but between 10%, which is Indonesia today, and 50% of Sweden, I think that one can agree that maybe getting closer to 15 or 20% tax to GDP will allow the government to actually have stronger basic education, so stronger protection for workers and for even for the informal sector, as well as a better prepared health system. That all those things, and especially as the population ages, these things actually cost money. So I think that would be one way that we could come out of this crisis, also looking at this angle of inequality. You would then finally ask me about the obstacles and the challenges of Indonesia to reaching the informal sector, as was the case in Brazil. I think that this is a challenge for everyone, and to mind what comes to mind is that the main challenge is precisely that the size of the tax to GDP ratio is so low that in order to very aggressively increase your expenditures, I mean, I think that there is a natural a bit greater reluctance in Indonesia, especially as you also don't have the systems. But a lot of countries actually did not have the systems. Brazil, they just developed an app. I understand that Thailand also created a program of transfers where the first day they had something like 20 million people immediately registering. So I think that Indonesia has already started with the Kartu Prakerja. That could be a platform that is already in place, where you already have people signing up. So perhaps that is something that can reach more people if necessary. But I think that would go back to the other question, that it's also important to really understand very well, who are the people that are being reached and who are the people who are still not being reached and that would require some of this assistance. And I think that this is something that obviously the government is working very hard to identify. So I think that it is not easy. I mean, most countries did not have, I mean, that's why it's the informal sector, right? I mean, they did not have in place programs already, but this is an opportunity to ensure that people have bank accounts. So in Brazil, for example, and that's something that I understand has been done in Indonesia in some cases, that once people become eligible for some of the social assistance, they immediately get a bank account. And then I think that the important thing would be then to make sure that they have the financial literacy to be able to use the bank account, but offering free bank accounts to people, that again is something that helps them receive the money that they need to meet their basic needs, but also has a benefit in the longer term that they become actually included in the financial system.
Federico, I've been reading your last economic quarterly reports, and there's one thing that I would like to address. That's probably something that you have addressed in the first few minutes of your lecture, but I was missing it. The policy response in continuance of the questions from the Jakarta Post, where Ibu Sri Mulyani has already issued bonds, but I was thinking about one of the elements that I read in the Too Big to Fail, that some people are actually buying bonds just because to see that the effort fail. What do you think of that? Because what I would like to hear from you is actually how Indonesia would be able to calculate the unintended consequences if you are supposed to issue more bonds and more people are buying it. What are the passengers that we wouldn't be able to know in these whole efforts, and how would be able to calculate the political and populist narrative that would come with it, and how do we calculate that into the policy response that has been talked about by Pak Gita earlier this morning? So that would be my questions. Thank you.
So in terms of the debt, I mean, there hasn't been a lot of demand, especially within Indonesia, for the bonds. Those bonds that were recently sold overseas, they were bought by a lot of investment funds, pension funds. In fact, I think that, again, one of the longer term agendas for Indonesia is to deepen its own financial market so that there is more demand from local pension funds, local mutual funds, that would actually also be a source of demand for some of these government securities. In the short term, I mean, as I said, I mean, I think that you do have a need, and you do have an important role for fiscal policy to be able to provide for the basic needs of most people during this relatively limited time that people are not able to work in order to contain the spread of the disease. And then I think that it's actually that having more debt at this time is not something that would be harmful. I think that what would be more harmful is to allow somebody to sell their sewing machines, or children to actually go without the right nutrition. I think that long term, those are much more costly than the interest in having to pay back that debt in the future. I mean, I think that's the purpose of using debt. And I think that goes back also to your question on the populist policies. I think that I would think of this issue of populist policies as something that is seen over a medium-term period, right? So if one were to continue with very high fiscal deficits, large amounts of transfers, even at a time that the economy is actually doing quite well, and then inflation might be going up, large current account deficit, I think that that's the symptom of the kind of what one usually calls the populist policies. But this is not the case. Let me be very clear that having these policies now is actually not so much not populism, because these are actually just meeting the livelihoods at a real time that everyone is agreed that there's a global crisis at hand. And those are precisely the times when you do need the government to actually spend more and borrow more. What will make it non-populist is precisely why I have been emphasizing that longer term there needs to be higher tax collections. The central bank needs to specify how it withdraws from the monetary stimulus. That's what will ultimately mean that this policy is actually not a populist policy at this time. And again, I go back to my own country where we have a fairly conservative government. I don't think that they would claim to be populist, but they're also implementing a similar kind of cash transfers and increasing the deficit and borrowing, and that's because we are in a time of crisis. Populism is about doing a lot of these things, that running high deficits, borrowing a lot, when you're not in a time of crisis. So it's not the case here, because we are in a crisis and we do need the governments to actually borrow so that they can provide for people's livelihoods, and so that firms can do this hibernation and then be able to reopen afterwards.
Before we head on to the next question, I want to synthesize a bit the three previous questions, and then now the most recent question, borrowing, was raised again. I guess this would I would ask now about what we discussed prior to the meeting, Federico. So Khatib Basri, our former Minister of Finance, a while ago tweeted about the availability of the bank's drawdown option, the DDO instrument, to assist in financing for COVID-19. I mean, Khatib Basri specifically mentioned it as an option. Now I just want to ask you, is this credit line readily available for pandemics such as COVID-19? And could you elaborate perhaps a bit on the DDO, the drawdown option that the bank provides?
The World Bank is mobilizing a lot of resources to help countries, and including in the case of Indonesia. Let me speak a little bit about the facilities that we are looking at right now, and then I'll speak a little bit about this deferred drawdown option, so which is actually not included in this first line of credit facilities that are currently in place. So the first priority is really to look at the health sector. So we do have the first wave of the resources that the World Bank has mobilized, both the World Bank and the IFC, is to directly help the health sector to increase the capacity to buy more respirators, to buy more protective equipment for the frontline healthcare workers, to invest in testing. So this has been the first kind of priority, and we do have something that I guess over the next couple of weeks we do expect to be supporting Indonesia as well directly on the health side. Then the other kinds of measures that one would look at is one, helping the social assistance measures. And we do have a long-term engagement in supporting the PKH and improving the database to make sure that everyone who needs to be receiving the PKH is included. So that's something that, that we'll continue to support both in Indonesia and in other places. And then there's just a general budget support, right? As I mentioned, I think that this is the time for the government to do what it takes in order to help with the livelihoods and to help the firms reopen, the firms stay healthy enough to reopen afterwards. So there will need to be budget support. And as I mentioned, although it's okay if the central bank needs to come in, if there are other sources like multilateral sources, those can actually also be helpful to minimize the use of this central bank resources. So this is kind of the second phase, is more on the social assistance and kind of the budget support phase, where you mobilize quickly resources that will help close the immediate gap. Obviously, a lot of the gap also comes because the tax revenues are lower. So even just running the regular expenditures of the government, you need to finance that from new sources. Because during the time of a crisis, normally the 10% tax to GDP is very low. And this is part of the concern with Indonesia, that under good times, the tax to GDP ratio is only 10%. But during the time of crisis, of course, there is a natural decline in the tax revenue. And that's when, again, the financing sources such as the World Bank's budget support can come into play. So these are the kind of support that the World Bank, but also in partnership with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Asian Development Bank, some of the bilateral partners. I think that there is a lot of effort to mobilize as much resources as we can in order to help Indonesia as well as other countries to face this, to meet this economic shock. Now, you asked specifically about the deferred drawdown option, which Pak Khatib mentioned. I think that maybe he remembers when we did that in the 2008-2009 crisis. I think that we do have something which is called the catastrophe deferred drawdown option. This is a bit of an insurance where you have something which is basically a line of credit that then if you have, let's say, an earthquake, then you can quickly trigger. But besides that, it also helps kind of put in place the right monitoring systems, the right recovery systems from that catastrophe. So we do think that this kind of emergency or this kind of insurance-like products, they can be used in the longer term. But in the case specifically of COVID, I think that we already hit by the shock, right? So the earthquake has already happened. So you cannot buy the insurance for you cannot buy your car insurance after you already hit a tree, right? The insurance company, after you already hit the tree, maybe there's a good reason, maybe I want to lend you money to fix your car because maybe it wasn't your fault. That as the case of the pandemic, right? It's not the fault of Indonesia. This is just something, what we call an exogenous shock. So I think that everyone is willing to come in and help Indonesia with this crisis, but the crisis is already ongoing. But I think that the point is in the longer term, again, I think that having more of these kind of insurance-like instruments, I think that that's something that can be very beneficial, especially when we think about natural disasters, which is something that Indonesia is periodically subject to, being in the ring of fire. So I do very much agree with Pak Khatib that going forward, if Indonesia has more of these facilities, it's actually going to be better able to cope, both in terms of making sure that the systems are well prepared. But then if you do have an earthquake, as you had the earthquake in Sulawesi or Lombok, that you actually have fast disbursing funds that can help meet some of those expenditures.
So, sir, I would like to ask you about the further problem that maybe will be facing by Indonesia for the government, because many of the manufacturer and also companies laid off their employees, and the next problem we will be facing is the unemployment rate. Do you think that it's a serious problem for the further? Because if this is not become the concern of the government will face that excess of productive age people, but the job is not so much, so there is a lot of unemployment. So do you think it's a serious problem or not? And what should the government do to solve this problem? Thank you.
Thank you. No, so I think that this is definitely a concern, and I think that is a concern in many countries. Again, in Indonesia, because the formal sector, the workers that actually have a wage contract, that work with a contract, is a relatively small share of the labor force compared to other countries. That's why I had emphasized a lot of the informal sector. But you're absolutely right that also, for those in the formal sector, this is something to be concerned about, and where one might look at, what are the kinds of facilities that one can offer to firms so that they can retain the workers employed, but have some kind of a facility, whether it's through tax, right? So these are the larger formal firms, so they would be paying tax, so maybe having some kind of a tax credit or a tax deferral if you retain the workers and you continue to pay at least, let's say 75 or 80 or 90% of their salaries, during this time. That may be something that one would want to look at. I have not seen, right now yet, as of yet, the magnitude of the issue with unemployment, but I think that it's certainly something that one would want to be looking at very closely. I think that a lot of the larger Indonesian firms, they probably can, withstand for a short period of time in terms of liquidity, in order to meet the payroll. But of course, it's something that is a concern around the world, and I think that it's something that one would want to look at, and if necessary, provide these kind of incentives for firms not to lay off their workers and to retain them on the payroll. As I said, it has double benefits. Not only are you still providing for the livelihood of those workers so that they can meet their basic needs, but also, for the most part, those firms actually selected those workers know how to work within those firms. So it's actually quite costly if afterwards, in a few months, you need to rehire a worker, or you hire a worker that is not familiar with how the firm operates. You need to train them. So that all causes a productivity loss. So it can really be a win-win to actually provide the right incentives for firms to retain their workers and not lay off their workers, in order both to maintain the livelihood of the workers, but also to have a smoother restart of the economy after the containment period.
My name is Monica Horaski, and I am an entrepreneur. So here is my question. Do you think there is a chance, hope, and probability for entrepreneur to rise again the business after COVID-19 outbreak? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. So I hope that, again, in the short term, what we hope for the entrepreneurs is that they have the ability to kind of hibernate their firms, either as the micro entrepreneur that doesn't need to sell their limited assets in order to meet basic livelihoods, or as a large entrepreneur that has rent and has taxes and loans, and that there is some kind of forbearance on those expenditures, so that they are not kind of forced into a bankruptcy just because there is no short-term liquidity and short-term cash flow. In the longer term, I think that's where the next phase will be. Once we've kind of controlled the spread of the disease, once we've kind of controlled all once we've made sure that people can maintain their livelihoods, which, as we were discussing, it's not always that easy for the informal sectors, or the fiscal needs are very large. So these are all very difficult things that we're all kind of struggling with in order to meet those demands. But clearly, very soon, the next step is to be thinking about, once we do have the recovery stage, right? So what are going to be the stimulus policies, which will include maybe some credit policies for entrepreneurs to start investing and hiring again. Once we want people back on the streets, and once we want the economy to restart. So I think that the government has put aside this 150 trillion rupiah kind of economic recovery package, which is basically some money set aside precisely to have the financing for programs during the recovery phase. I think it's going to be important to design those very well, so that the most promising and high growth entrepreneurs can be supported, both so that overall you have a lot of productivity growth in the economy, but also so that those entrepreneurs can then create a lot of good and very productive jobs.
My question is about the transportation sector. We know that transportation sector accounts a significant portion of informal workers, and I'm not talking only about motorcycle taxis. I'm also talking about bus drivers or those who work in transportation companies who do not always enjoy employment security. The Lebaran, or mudik, or the annual migration is a significant portion of their annual revenue. What do you think the government should do now that we are considering to and I think there's good reason to do so, to ban or to significantly restrict this annual migration? Thank you so much.
So I think that, again, for the very small entrepreneurs, if you're just somebody with your motorcycle, having that kind of social assistance, whether it's through the Kartu Prakerja, whether it's through Sembako, ensuring that people have the ability to meet their basic needs even when they're not working. With a lot of transportation, I think that there's some room for repurposing, right? You see a lot of especially in urban areas, in terms of doing the shopping and having food deliveries. That's still, obviously, there's a large reduction, but it's not down to zero. So to the extent that some of this can be done safely, I think that kind of repurposing is still something that one should look at creatively, of how do you keep as many people active as it's safe, and that it's supporting the broader objective of keeping the majority of people at home. For those that are in formal companies, or for those that are in kind of more the small and medium-sized companies, I think that, again, looking at ways in which some of these companies could maintain, at least these workers employed, and then offering some kind of, since Indonesia doesn't have the unemployment insurance, some other kind of insurance in the meantime. I think that will be important. And then I think that one can also look medium term, right? So I think that the government very wisely announced that the Cuti Bersama is going to be moved to December. So if you combine that with then having another opportunity later on when it's safe for people to go out, so that many of these families can actually compensate through higher activity at that time, right? So maybe they didn't have the mudik this year, and there was actually the activity was depressed in May, but if we can move that activity to later, and in some cases that unfortunately will not be possible, but in some cases, and that's where we need to be creative, some of that may be possible, and then you can actually ensure that there is additional earnings at that time. So even if some of these families may have gone into debt, or they may have gone with very low consumption levels, because they're only receiving some kind of assistance when the mobility is restricted. Once the mobility is allowed again, to make sure that we create also these as many opportunities as possible for these families that depend on this transportation sector, to be able to have those income earning opportunities later on. So I think that already I saw that as actually being very wise, that now is not the time for people to be having large scale moves out of Jakarta. But that that doesn't mean that this cannot happen later in the year, and that hopefully with additional policies of the government, whether it's declaring holidays or having some kind of incentives for some of the businesses, to allow those workers to actually take their leave and be with their families in the village at a time when it's safe for them to do so from the point of view of the epidemic, but that will also make up to some extent the losses of that particular sector.
Hi, Federico. Hope you are well. I'm here at ADB, Asian Development Bank, as a consultant. So I know that you did your presentation, but I wonder whether you can elaborate more on what the Bank Indonesia and OJK should do, what kind of policy they should have to help the banking sector. As you know, the banking sector will also cross the real sector moving forward in this COVID situation. What would happen to the NPL? What kind of restructuring program, if you may suggest, that should be considered? And lastly, how long do you think if restructuring, a mass restructuring program should be implemented? Will that be 1 year or so? Okay. Thank you.
I'm not a financial sector expert, so I'm a bit reluctant to speak too much on the details of the resolution and how to fix the balance sheet of the banks, because I think that here the interest is to balance out this issue of moral hazard, right? So if you always allow people to pay whenever they want, then you cannot have a banking sector. At the same time, if you strictly enforce that even during the time of COVID, everybody needs to pay or they'll be bankrupt and their assets will be liquidated, then there is not going to be a recovery. So we need to find the correct space between those two extremes. And since I'm not an expert, I find it hard to put my finger exactly how OJK or Bank Indonesia should make sure to balance out the need for the cash flow relief in the short term with preventing the moral hazard and ensuring the soundness and the sustainability of the financial sector in the longer term. I think that what I can say is that we are the justification for these relaxations, that we are in the middle of a very specific crisis, which is supposed to be time bound to when there's a recommendation that people have to stay at recommendation, or sometimes order, right, that people need to stay at home. So I think that ensuring that this is really something that is time bound, some of these measures, I think that is probably going to be an important component, right? So if it's about deferring payments, if it's about looking at the credit conditions as of 2019, so that you are actually rewarding the companies that have a track record of being well run and having been able to make their payments, and now only during this particular time they're having difficulties, and that creates some kind of a postponement of the payments to later on. So having this very kind of time-bound and temporary measures, and again, communicating very clearly and then enforcing that these are temporary measures, I think that that's going to be important. That goes back to some of the questions on monetary policy. I think that's the same thing with BI and quantitative easing, right? I think that the Indonesian government has developed this track record for actually managing its finances very responsibly, and that applies to monetary policy as well, right? So the inflation expectations have been very well grounded. Bank Indonesia has done a balancing act of ensuring the right capital flows, financing the current account. So I think that you will want to continue to have that kind of a reputation, and it can do that if it's if some of these measures that are more relaxed are again time bound to cover the duration of the crisis, but where once the crisis is no longer there, that you have a clear plan that you need to go back to the kind of discipline. And I think that the same thing will be true with the financial sector, that the forbearance needs to be time bound. And then, once the economy is running again, that you actually have the discipline to ensure that the financial sector's balance sheets can be recomposed. Some of that, of course, through may require some kind of equity injection from the government or from BI, but some of that will have to come from actually companies that once they recover, they resume their payment and they become the kind of the solid credits that they were before.
Okay. Hello, good afternoon. Yeah, thank you, Pak Frederico, for the great explanation, and thank you for SGPP. Now I'm gonna ask topping down questions about, since you're from World Bank, so it will be interesting if you are talking about interest rates. So talking about slashing interest rates by 25 BPS twice in Indonesia from 4 to, but compared to another country like Central Bank, the Fed, England, and other countries, would it be effective if we do a more lowering the cut rates, like let's say like a 2% for developing country in Indonesia? And second, what would be the green lights condition for the firm or for the companies to take more loan? Let's say we have lowering the interest rates once again, maybe in May, let's say, and what will be the green lights condition for the companies to take more loan from the bank to regenerate their cash flow, because in order to pay their payroll to their employee to avoid the unemployment rates. And the last question related to Susana's question also. Thank you, Mbak Susana. What would you say to the policy authorities in order the bank could have warranty to the companies in order companies could have a going concern and to repay the loan? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. So in terms of the interest rates, I mean, I think that the concern has been, there are two issues with the policy interest rate from the point of view of BI as opposed to the Fed, for example. Yeah. The first is that you do need to have that interest rate differential so that your holders of foreign securities are still kind of willing to come in. Maybe not as much as they were in the past. Maybe there is a net selling, but you still need to maintain that kind of relative attractiveness of Indonesian assets relative to US assets, especially in a time of capital outflows, as is the case now. So BI has always kind of struck that difficult balancing act that it needs to have some kind of a positive interest rate differential with the US in order to keep attracting the portfolio flows. So long term, this is something where the World Bank has been talking a lot about the importance of bringing in more FDI. If you had a lot of FDI and BI doesn't have to worry about portfolio flows, then maybe has a bit more latitude with the policy rate. But right now, FDI is very weak. We know there are a lot of restrictions to FDI. So BI does need to pay attention to the interest rate differential to keep the portfolio flows coming. Okay. The second dimension to that is that it's also not so clear that their transmission mechanism from the policy rate to the, at the other side, the actual lending to the firms, that is translating very rapidly into easier lending conditions for the firms, right? So when BI was raising rates, the lending rates were coming down, and then BI started cutting rates, and it took a long time for the lending rates to come down. So I think that for many firms, I mean, I think that the importance is to make sure that the banks are still lending and that the margins are not very elevated. As we know in Indonesia, the net interest margin of banks is also very high. So if you have, reasonable margins and the current policy rates, as long as there is financing availability, I think that is more of first order importance for the corporates and for ensuring that they have the right liquidity levels as opposed to a much lower policy rate. So you have both of these factors. I think that's why we haven't seen as aggressive kind of cuts in the policy rate here as we have seen in from some other central banks. But at the same time, you did have BI very clearly, according to the Perpu, now allowed to come into the primary market and before even buying the bonds that the foreigners were selling in the secondary market. So BI is active. It has lowered the reserve requirements. It is active where it can in order to make sure that there's liquidity in the system, but the policy rate itself may not be the right instrument. Now, as far as the question of the kind of going forward with the banking sector, I think that increasing the depth, increasing the efficiency of the financial sector through more competition, I think that's something that longer term is going to be helpful for Indonesia to have a deeper, more resilient financial sector that is also more efficient, and where you actually have, going back to the first part of the question, this easier transmission of the monetary policy all the way down to the firms that are borrowing, that are trying to access the credit facilities, and that actually will make sure that longer term the monetary policy can also have a more stimulating effect on the economy.
Okay, thank you, Pat. So yeah, we would not be expecting the bad cycle, when there is no trust from the bank and there is no trust from the company, so the economic will not be growing. Okay, thank you, SGPP. Thank you, Frederico.
Thank you. No, this is precisely right. I think that OJK, to the extent that they can encourage the banks to look at the recent performance as of 2019, as of pre-COVID, and treating COVID as really this temporary shock, to maintain this trust between the bank and the firms. That what is happening now, I think that we can all agree that this is really an unanticipated shock. It's not because the company is mismanaged or because it took excessive risks that it's unable to pay at this particular time. So I think that figuring out all the ways in which we can do that is going to help the economy.
I'm Andrew. I'm an entrepreneur. I am now currently working with some kind of woodworking business, something like woodcraft something. And then And as we know, right now, the startup, Indonesia is one of the startup country that is now emerged. From this pandemic, how do you see this pandemic really affect the venture capitals, all of the investor behavior to put their money to this emerging startup? My second question is, Federico, as you mentioned previously, we are now, the government is really concerning about the basic needs. Do you really suggest that all of these, I mean, like an entrepreneur like us was really working with the micro business, do you think that is it a good opportunity to shift to really focus on basic needs? I mean, like, yeah, for a while, not like, yeah, something like that, I think. Thank you.
So I think that, yeah, so for now, I think that a lot of the investment funds are going to be on the sideline. But again, I think that to the extent that, you know, economies can restart, if governments have actually kept, again, the liquidity and firms are able to restart, if we were able to contain the epidemic within a certain period of time, and then we can restart the economy and most of the firms are there to actually do the restarting. I think that some of that venture capital money will come back. Of course, I think that people will be trying to reevaluate, are we living in a different world? Are there different, you know, is there a different focus that maybe wasn't there before? So I think that there may be a lag, but I think that money which is currently on the sidelines most likely will come back. I think that the question in terms of necessities, I think that depends, right? I think that that depends on whether you're able to repurpose for that. So I think that it's something that, you know, maybe this is a good time for a lot of the entrepreneurs to reassess the business strategy and to think, you know, to imagine how can we have a better world post-COVID. And, you know, normally you're trying to do things, you're still running the business, and obviously it's very difficult. So maybe this is also the time for a lot of entrepreneurs to take the time to reflect of how can you improve your businesses. Is it that, you know, maybe you can also improve your accounting skills or your management skills? How can you improve the products or services that you're selling? Because I think that, you know, most of the economic activity will come back, but we can come back better. And I think that this kind of mobility restrictions are actually giving us an opportunity to, you know, in some cases, even though it's kind of forced us to do that, to take a step back and imagine how some of those businesses, you know, can actually operate better in the future. And in that sense, I think that, you know, some of that consideration might be, you know, can I now, you know, repurpose towards doing things that will help with the, you know, the containment of the crisis, whether it's through medical equipment or medicine or through basic needs and necessities. You know, I forgot to mention with the Ministry of Education is now doing educational programming on TV. There's a lot of room now for thinking about kind of remote learning and how can we actually help the kids to catch up and not to lose out on the, you know, weeks of class that they've missed. A lot of that actually calls for a lot of creativity. And of course, you know, this is also why this matter of the government providing for the basic livelihoods is so important, and also for the companies not to have to worry about going bankrupt. Because if you're an entrepreneur and you're no longer worried about running your business, but you have to worry about, you know, how do you, you know, pay the bank or pay your taxes, then you're also not going to be able to productively use this time to improve your business processes, improve some of the skills. So this is also why some of these investments, they're also important in the long term, that if people feel that they have enough kind of resources to feed their families, to meet their basic needs, if they know that the bank is not going to be hounding them and trying to seize their motorcycle or seizing some of their assets, that actually will give them time to invest in their own skills and to invest in their own kind of business plans and to improve the productivity of their businesses. So it's also an investment in productivity once the crisis is over by providing this kind of support, what I call the hibernation support and the livelihood support.
Hi, Federico, and thank you so much for taking this last question. I'm in the consumer goods sector, so the theme of my question is recovery in the post-COVID era. My question is, if we assume that the world has a handle on the pandemic by June, what would Q3 and Q4, in your estimation, look like in terms of the Indonesian economy, in the context of, is it going to be sudden boom, or will there be still a period of adjustment? And then, the Indonesian economy sort of comes back to its pre-COVID peak sort of in Q1 of next year. And is there any learning from China that sort of can guide some of this thinking?
Thank you for the question. That's a tough one, because right now we're under a lot of uncertainty. So we are all I'm Brazilian, we're hopeful by nature. So I'm hoping that by June we will have gotten a handle on the epidemic. But the fact is, nobody knows, right? The sentiment has deteriorated very rapidly. Maybe it can also improve very rapidly, but we really have to be humble and acknowledge that we don't know. It may come June and we may still be under a lot of uncertainty. So even if there is a relaxation of some of the restrictions, but if we're still under a lot of uncertainty, if there is still a relatively high number of new cases coming in every day, I think that could make the recovery a lot more protracted. Now, if we quickly identified a treatment, if the curves are really coming down very sustainably, and then that uncertainty has reduced quite substantially by July, August, also because it would have been a relatively short time, that those companies have been in hibernation. Obviously, the shorter the hibernation, the easier it is to wake them up. I think that one could expect a very robust recovery. But it's just very difficult to make those projections right now. I think that it's equally possible that things could improve very rapidly, that they could remain very uncertain for a relatively protracted period of time, even as some activity normalization happens, or that things that some of these expectations get worse again. We hope that doesn't happen. I think that expectations are already quite negative, but we can't rule that out. So let's just hope everyone kind of tried as best as possible to stay at home in order to get a handle on that pandemic, keep on asking about, improving some of the health responses and making sure that the policies are in place so that this hibernation period can be succeeded by a period of quick awakening of the economy.